I will be talking about electoral decision making today and how technology can modulate our decision making process. So generally in decision making, we can distinguish between several stages. We start by collecting information, we filter through the information, analyze it, come up with a set of alternatives, which we will weigh and choose the one that's most appropriate in a given situation. And each of these stages is modulated through technological applications and technological aids. So if we take a generic use case, we have our immediate context and the world that we live and act in. From this context, we extract a set of data, which we may use to train a model or which we use to inform the design of a model. We interpret and use the model output in order to make a decision. And by our action, we impact either the data directly or indirectly through interaction in the real world. So there's a number of places here where bias may arise. And perhaps one of the more discussed ones is algorithmic bias. So if we have an application, a model that disproportionately biases one group over another, this may be either due to the algorithm itself, a biased algorithm, due to inadequate representation of the data, or due to inequalities and biases in the real world that are reflected in the data. Now, the good news here is that these biases are well known and well researched. So we've heard a lot about machine learning yesterday, or we've heard a bit about it. And so we can hope for technological advancements in solving these issues of unfair representation. This is also reflected in regulatory approaches. We've also mentioned the AI Act yesterday. The AI Act attempts or aims to classify use cases based on the risk and to impose a set of requirements and regulations on AI models that will, depending on the risk, ensure things like human agency and oversight, protection of human rights, or non-discrimination. But something that's reflected in this generic use case, which the AI Act is not specifically focusing, is the impact of inserting technology into a given process. So this is something Andrew Selbst has called the ripple effect. By using an aid, we may actually change the underlying valuation of a process. So if we consider, as an example, the compass system that was used in juridical decision-making in the US and was hotly debated, but the compass system was debated for different reasons, but generally it weighed the risk of recidivism. And by having a numerical score associated with recidivism risk, this has been found to unduly increase or to increase the valuation that people using the compass system put on recidivism risk, as opposed to other factors that can be influential in decision making, such as the perceived remorsefulness of an offender. A second issue is the representativeness or the appropriateness of using a decision support system in a given context. So we know from operations research that in a situation where where we have a highly complex context, and on the other hand, a deterministic and restrictive system, relying on such a system in order to make our task can impact how cognitively involved we are in the decision-making process. So it may lead to the decision maker not investing as much time and resources as they would otherwise, actually prioritizing being efficient in their decision-making, and by extension, also learning this. So if we apply this, or if we consider now a specific use case on how we make electoral decisions, the political information that we perceive is quite complex. It's the decisions we make are intermingled with our own identity, in part, with our own value system, and and we don't really have a clear separation of opinions and news and potential manipulation attempts from the outside. So a method that has gained more and more popularity in the recent years in order to navigate this complex political space was voting advice applications. Voting advice applications such as the Wahlkabine in Austria or Smart Vote in Switzerland, they provide the user with a set of questions which they use to elicit the user's political opinions and values, and in return provide the user with a ranked list of which parties or candidates are most reflective of his or her own stances. So they are quite widespread, especially in Europe, where we have multi-party systems with small and smallest parties emerging and dying before elections, where we have quite strongly shifting political landscapes. And frankly, it's hard to keep an overview. So voting advice applications claim the goal of increasing political competence, of increasing also electoral turnout. And they have, in fact, seen some success here at increasing turnout, especially for groups which are traditionally underrepresented in elections. And they aim to facilitate voter choice. So if we take a look at how they work internally, this is a generic model of a voting advice application, as they are common in the majority of European countries, at least among the ones that are most widely used. We have an internal representation of party or candidate positions on some sort of political mapping. We elicit the user's position on this mapping through a questionnaire, and then we compare the two using user or expert assigned issue weights and following a certain distance logic to arrive at this set of recommendations. So we have quite a simple and inherently interpretable system. It's transparent. Even a user without a technical background is able to understand and follow why they received the recommendation they received. So one of the issues we see here is susceptibility to design bias rather than algorithmic bias. So based on what kind of internal representation of the political space we use, we may arrive at vastly different recommendations. So in a study in quite an old study of 2014, it's been found that StemWiser, which is one of the, well, perhaps the oldest voting advice application in Europe, and certainly one of the most popular ones, by changing from a high to a low dimensional political representation, this means that rather than considering each question a separate axis and taking the distance in between each of these axes independently, but instead projecting each question onto a scale from left to right and from liberal to conservative. So by changing this design choice, we arrive at different recommendations for the vast majority of users. So in fact, in the study, it was around 90% who received a different recommendation on the first in the first ranking. And this is one of many design choices that are contained in such a transparent algorithm. A different one concerns the voting logic we use, and here there's been some work on using voting advice applications in order to measure what logic we attribute as voters to which question. And it's been found that some questions, for example, pertaining to economy or pertaining to more to issues we usually consider with a bit more distance, they elicit a different voting logic than questions that are more visceral, more connected to identity or to one's own place in the world. So There have been some attempts at, or there are some different design approaches in order to move away from this susceptibility to design choices, such as, for example, social recommendations, where rather than having a content-based recommender system, you will receive a recommendation based on users who have answered in political questions similarly to you. So you don't have the positioning of the political parties or candidates on the political space directly, but you are compared to other users. However, these attempts come with their own issues, of course, and they are not very common yet. Oh, I think speaker died. Thank you. So, considering even this model I have introduced before of a transparent distance function, essentially, voting advice applications don't necessarily adhere to standards of trustworthy design. So what we see here is from current work, a representation of trustworthiness onto a series of requirements that are outlined in the ethics guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence by the high-level expert group, which is also the basis of the requirements contained in the AI Act. And we see that voting advice applications, although many of them are supported by public funding, and they have an interest in being perceived as trustworthy and transparent, they don't score terribly highly according to the ethics guidelines. So, as has been put into words quite eloquently by Vossen and van der Brink, a voting advice application cannot simply reflect what is at stake in an election by neutrally passing along information. Essentially, the recommendation you give and the application you design as a person will be colored by your own notions of, well, in this case of politics, but it will be colored by your own value system. So the designer has a lot of power they may not be aware of. So some attempts that we can mention to limit the powers of designers include participatory design. And there are some voting advice applications that use participatory design or elements thereof, such as, for example, the Valomat in Germany, which is co-created by an editorial board that includes young voters, experts from academia, journalism, and politics, as well as the government itself. However, even within such participatory design attempts, there's not a lot of focus on diversity. If it is considered, then diversity mainly adheres to age group, rather than, for example, other factors. A second issue is the problem of cognitive involvement. So participatory design is, well, we have seen from operations research that using an application that is not adequately involving the user in the decision-making process may decrease cognitive involvement and may lead to the user learning less. And the question of whether this is something we want from a voting advice application really depends on one's notion and one's values in a democratic system. So voting advice applications, as they are now, they're quite liberal in their design. So they adhere to social choice, where the user's preferences are considered to be static. And the problem to solve is a gap of ignorance. So the user is interested in shopping for those policies that best reflect and further his or her own interests. this is certainly an important notion in democracy, but it's not the only one. So what about, for example, the role of leadership, the constructive role of organizations and groups, or of deliberation, or even of the productive role of conflict that we have in interaction in society? A user's preferences can change. And this is not reflected as it is now within VAA designs. So essentially, the question I want to ask is what questions we really should ask to technology, right? Who should I vote for is not a question we have the answer for. We don't have a ground truth either, so we can't really evaluate the output of a voting advice application given that we don't know the answer. And usually what's used to evaluate voting advice applications in the form that they're common now is voting intention. So a user will be asked what they intend to vote before the questionnaire, and if after doing the process in the voting advice application, if the output matches the intention, it's considered to be accurate. But that really clashes with the intent of learning, with the intent of being a source of information, on the one hand. Secondly, we don't just vote based on issue alignment. So we also vote on other factors, such as leadership or such as perceived competence. And therefore, I wonder, do voting advice applications in the form we use them now make a lot of sense? And so to design a voting advice application according to democratic values, we really need to ask what those are. What are those democratic values? If we consider, for example, a more deliberative approach to democracy, would a voting advice application not look more like a massive online deliberation platform, which puts people in touch and in communication? So in the end, I want to stress the importance of value-based design. And there we go.